So we just went through all of the 3D asset and the texture creation steps that we're now going to be bringing into Unity. So before we start importing, just for organization's sake, we want to create a couple of folders here for our models. And textures. Okay, now I have all of these in a folder. And these are going to be all of our folders here are going to be represented the same ones as in Unity. So it's fine if I want to. I can import them into Unity directly. I can also import them through the file manager. So I have my textures here. And I'm just going to copy them into the textures folder. Okay, here's our character, environment sphere, and our level. There's an FBX. You can also try as a Collada file, as a GAE, that's fine. In this case, we're going to be using the FBX format. Now, when I'm going to go back into Unity, it's going to start importing all of these models. We want to make sure all of the settings are the ones that we would specify in order to bring them into our level. So Unity brings in each object with a different scale than for each available format. So let's see how this Blockman model would look in our level. So it's pretty much invisible. You can, by pressing F, you can kind of see it before the camera clipping will actually start to cut it off, so we would probably want to scale this higher. Let's see if we multiply this by 10, and in the bottom, make sure to press apply. Okay, it seems to be a little bigger. Let's multiply that by 2.2. Let's see how that looks. Okay, I think that's going to be fine. Now, I also created the materials here, which I can then, the materials are not going to be transferred, but they are going to be linked, and they're going to give us a better sense if we want to assign the materials later on. You can see that I've got one listed here, which I wouldn't have listed if I didn't have anything assigned in Blender or Maya or whatever you're going to be using. In this case, it's simply a good naming convention, and it's more organized. So I'm going to move on to the level in a second, but let's look at our environment sphere. Okay, it's going to be, once again, a little small. We're going to multiply this by 100. See how that looks. Okay. That's still too small. We can actually multiply this in the level itself, and we can change the scale. Let's still too small. Let's make this 20. See how that looks. Okay, so now we can see our characters still, and we can also see within the sphere. It's because I've got the normals flipped, meaning that the facing triangle for each one of the polygons is going to be facing inside instead of outside. In your 3D modeling package, you might not notice this because they have normals that are facing both directions. Not the case in Unity, simply to save calculational resources. And I'm going to demonstrate this where it's really important. So we're going to come back to our level, bring this in. We're going to scale it up. Now you can either scale this within the import settings, or you can scale it within the actual scene view. Both achieve the same result. Okay, so here's our level. Now, this won't actually work if we are to use this as a collision engine, because you can see that the normals are facing the other direction. So if we have any sort of rigid body, then the character will simply fall through. You can try applying that here. We're not going to be using this method, so I'm just going to do this very roughly. Okay, our character seems to be positioned. We see that he is within the borderlines of our level here. So we will need to do two things. We will need to give him a box collider, or any other collider will work actually. The reason that we're using a box collider is just to save computational resources. And we're also going to need to give him a rigid body, so he will react to a physics engine. We also want to do this to the level. Only we do not need a rigid body, we simply need a collider, because we want this to collide with objects that have a rigid body, but we do not want it to be a rigid body itself. And we would not need to be a box collider, it would need to be a mesh collider, because we're using all of the triangles here to create a collision. Usually you would not want to make this, especially with an organic object, because it's very computationally expensive. But because this is a very primitive object, this will be fine. Okay? So let's give this a try. Okay, and we clearly see our object falling through the floor. We need to bring in the mesh of the level that would need to have its normals reversed. You can see them on the bottom, but not on the top. So I'm going to delete this. Okay, and bring in another version which has the normals reversed. You can only do this in your modeling package. You cannot do this in Unity. Okay, so here we are. We want to apply the same level as we had before. That's fine. It'll display a dialog whether you want to apply these settings or not. And we do not want to rig. Click None, Apply. Let's just bring this in real quick. Okay, that looks pretty good. Do the same thing again. Apply a mesh collider. And let's bring this a little lower. Okay, now the character should now land on the floor and act to the mesh collider with its rigid body and its own box collider. Let's give that a test. Seems like we have a proper collision. But like I said before, we're not going to be using a rigid body system for our Blockman hero. We're going to be using something called a character controller.